So this session closes out our reading of Chapter 27 in the Life Divine, the Gnostic Being. Sri Aurobindo has been working in the context of a general question: how might an illuminated individual who lives in the gnosis, the larger knowledge with a capital K, behave? Would his behavior be consonant with the needs of others? Would his behavior be impelled by truth, or deterred by ego, as is typical human behavior? If this Gnostic consciousness is installed in a human, does it change the way the human behaves? In a collective, will that being live differently? So he's in the middle of that, and he said in closing of the last paragraph that we looked at, a harmonic action, a working out of the divine motive, an execution of the imperative truth of things would be the law and natural dynamics of the whole existence. So in other words, yes, because this being lives not in a putative theoretical oneness with all, but lives from the one, from inside out, from the essence of nature, through all the instrumentalities, but begins from here, from the truth consciousness. So now we continue with a theme that is very familiar to us: a knowledge by identity, using the powers of the integrated being for richness of instrumentation, would be the principle of the supramental life. Knowledge by identity. Remember, in his epistemology, this is how one comes to real knowledge. Knowledge by indirection, knowledge that you go out and gather by assembling sensory data and fashion it into some theoretical framework, which then you match up against experience and against things that you measure, can give you a kind of working knowledge, at least a beginning of knowledge, but it's not the real thing. You're always examining something outside yourself. The kind of knowledge with a capital K that he's speaking about proceeds from an identity of being. There is no gulf between subject and object. One is that. That is oneself. And so you simply lean with the power of your consciousness into the other being to see what are its contents. You can know what you wish to know. And you come back with that without having done hurt, leaving all in harmony, because the sight that penetrates is the one self. So knowledge by identity is the king knowledge, you might say. He says, a knowledge by identity using the powers of the integrated being for richness of instrumentation would be the principle of the supramental life. So he's given you the hint right here. The oneness is not a monotone. It's going to throw itself out in rich forms. It's going to explore infinity infinitely. He continues, in the other grades of the Gnostic being, although a truth of spiritual being and consciousness would fulfill itself, the instrumentation would be of a different order. A higher mental being would act through the truth of thought, the truth of the idea, and accomplish that in the life action. But in the supramental gnosis, thought is a derivative movement. It is a formulation of truth vision, and not the determining or the main driving force. It would be an instrument for expression of knowledge more than for arrival at knowledge or for action. Or It would intervene in action only as a penetrating point of the body of identity will and identity knowledge. So you see here, married in the Gnostic consciousness are will and knowledge. They are a single movement, the obverse and reverse of the same coin. What you see, you can do. What you wish to do is filled with knowledge. So the Gnostic being could engage and would engage at any of several levels. The higher mental, characterized by thought. The illumined mind, the, pardon me, and the intuitive mind would participate with truth vision and a direct truth contact. Remember, he described intuition as possessing a power of knowledge directly, so that it is like the gnosis of the supramental itself. But where the supramental is the sun, intuition is like a ray of light coming from that sun. The supramental is vastitude itself. Mahas is the other word for it, the vast. But intuition can know truly at a single point. Just as the illumined mind, illumined with a light from above, knows too. Just as the thought power of higher mind knows but fashions the knowledge that it gets into formulated thought. So these are those various grades of consciousness. He continues, in the overmind, a comprehensive, immediate grasp of the truth of things and the principle of being of each thing and all its dynamic consequences would originate and gather up a great wideness of Gnostic vision and thought and create a foundation of knowledge and action. This largeness of being and seeing and doing would be the varied result of an underlying identity consciousness, but the identity itself would not be in the front as the very stuff of the consciousness or the very force of the action. And he can speak intimately about that because this overmental consciousness had established itself in him all the way down to the level of matter, into his very body in 1926. So here we are, a dozen years later and more, and Sri Aurobindo is writing about this overmental experience and the treasures of knowledge that it gives, but also the limitations where its borders cease. And he continues now. But in the supramental gnosis, all this luminous immediate grasp of the truth of things, truth sense, truth vision, truth thought, would get back into its source of identity consciousness and subsist as a single body of its knowledge. The identity consciousness would lead and contain everything. It would manifest as an awareness in the very grain of the being substance, putting forth its inherent self-fulfilling force and determining itself dynamically in form of consciousness and form of action. Chit Shakti. This inherent awareness is the origin and principle of the working of supramental gnosis. It could be sufficient in itself, with no need of anything to formulate or embody it, but the play of illumined vision, the play of a radiant thought, the play of all other movements of the spiritual consciousness would not be absent. There would be a free instrumentation of them for their own brilliant functioning, for a divine richness and diversity, for a manifold delight of self-manifestation, for the joy of the powers of the infinite. In the intermediate stages or degrees of the gnosis, there might be the manifestation of various and separate expressions of the aspects of the divine being and nature, a soul and life of love, a soul and life of divine light and knowledge, a soul and life of divine power and sovereign action and creation, and innumerable other forms of divine life. On the supramental height, all would be taken up into a manifold unity, a supreme integration of being and life, a fulfillment of the being in a luminous and blissful integration of its states and powers, and their satisfied dynamic action would be the sense of the Gnostic existence. So you can see here again echoes of Sat-Chit Ananda appearing again and again. Sat, the truth of being. Chit, not simply the vast awareness of truth in all its forms and glorious manifestations, but also the willed manifestation of it. It leans out in fashions, it leans out and does, it creates, and of course, the delight, the bliss is at the core of everything, and the reason for doing anything. So he describes here, in this fulfillment of the being, something that is intimate to him. The fulfillment of his yoga, the integral yoga, would mean the fulfillment of all of these things at once, in a constant, sustained harmony, a chord, C-H-O-R-D, of being, which would be a crescendo of the whole cosmic formulation as found utterance through the earth life. So this, of course, is the substance that we see in his record of yoga, where he is sedulously working on establishing siddhi in himself, not for himself, but as an agent of the entire world, that if he succeeds, then it stands as exhibitory truth for the whole of the human manifestation upon earth, and therefore speaks for the earth life as a whole. So in other words, he was doing this himself. He's writing about it here, but this is the fruit of his practice. All supramental gnosis is a twofold truth consciousness, a consciousness of inherent self-knowledge, and by identity of self and world, of intimate world knowledge. This knowledge is the criterion, the characteristic power of the gnosis. So, individual and cosmos, both significant terms of real being which is transcendent. They are not opposed. They lean into each other. They are simultaneous expressions of a single truth that exists beyond them. But this is not a purely ideative knowledge. It is not consciousness observing, forming ideas, trying to carry them out. It is an essential light of consciousness, the self-light of all the realities of being and becoming, the self-truth of being, determining, formulating, and effectuating itself. And this, as we've seen, goes back to Vedantic origins. This goes back to the Upanishads. For instance, the Mundaka Upanishad. Look at 2.2, verses 10 through 12, and you find something that is very kin to what he's writing here. To be, not to know, is the object of the manifestation. Knowledge is only the instrumentation of an operative consciousness of being. So, Sat, true being, what is real. Chit, the conscious aspect of that same truth of being, conscious power, throws out from itself knowledge as an expression of consciousness, but it is not all that is consciousness. Consciousness is a greater power, and knowledge is a faculty of that conscious being. This would be the Gnostic life on earth, a manifestation or play of truth-conscious being, being grown aware of itself in all things, no longer lost to consciousness of itself, no longer plunged into a self-oblivion or a half-oblivion of its real existence, brought about by absorption in form and action, but using form and action with a delivered spiritual power for its free and perfect self-expression, no longer seeking for its own lost or forgotten or veiled and hidden significance or significances, no longer bound, but delivered from inconscience and ignorance, aware of its own truths and powers, determining freely in a movement always concurrent and in tune in every detail with its supreme and universal reality, its manifestation, the play of its substance, the play of its consciousness, the play of its force of existence, the play of its delight of existence. So here he sings again of Chit, Sat, and Ananda in this phrase. Normally we say Sat, Chit, Ananda, but it's a manner of speaking. Truth-conscious being grown aware of itself. Ritta Chitvik, what we saw in the opening citations from the Rig Veda. Using form in action, not being absorbed into ignorance, not being absorbed in the form and action, because when you are absorbed in the form and action and forget yourself, you ignore your greater self and you suffer diminution because ignoring becomes ignorance. But here, using form and action as an expression of this immense being, alive and in love with all of its infinite variety and pouring it out in a harmonic way, in a constant play. Play, as described in the Trika philosophy, which Sri Aurobindo regrettably had no familiarity with, that ancient teaching that was housed in Kashmir Shaivism, that never made it to Sri Aurobindo's doorstep. He had so much in common with it. And yet he speaks here of this play of delight, this play of consciousness. And it was at least glimpsed in an earlier philosophy a millennium ago. But Sri Aurobindo brings it so much more fully into expression here because he involves it in the whole of cosmic evolution. And I'll stop there. In the Gnostic evolution, there would be a great diversity in the poise, status, harmonized operations of consciousness and force and delight of existence. There would naturally appear in time many grades of the farther ascent of the evolutive supermind to its own summits. But in all, there would be the common basis and principle. In the manifestation of the spirit, the being, while knowing all itself, is not bound to put forth all itself in the actual front of formation and action, which is its immediate power and degree of self-expression. It may put forth a frontal self-expression and hold all the rest of itself behind in an unexpressed delight of self-being. That all behind and its delight would find itself in the front, know itself in it, maintain and suffuse the expression, the manifestation, with its own presence and feeling of totality and infinity. This frontal formation, with all the rest behind it and held in power of being within it, would be an act of self-knowledge, not an act of ignorance. It would be a luminous self-expression of the superconscience and not an upthrow from the inconscience. In other words, it isn't imperative that it has to express everything that it knows and is at once. It can hold some behind. Just as you can hold a thought to yourself and not express it, but be keenly master of that thought. A great harmonized variation would thus be an element in the beauty and completeness of the evolution of the Gnostic consciousness and existence. Even in dealing with the mind of ignorance around it, as in dealing with the still lower degrees of the Gnostic evolution, the supramental life would use this innate power and movement of its truth of being. It would relate, in the light of that integral reality, its own truth of being with the truth of being that is behind the ignorance. It would found all relations upon the common spiritual unity, accept and harmonize the manifested difference. The Gnostic light would ensure the right relation and action or reaction of each upon each and every circumstance. The Gnostic power or influence would affirm always a symphonic effectuation, secure the right relation of the more developed and the less developed life, and impose by its influence a greater harmony on the lower existence. So here he describes the impact on the balance of the evolving line. This would be the nature of the being, life, and action of the Gnostic individual, so far as we can follow the evolution with our mental conception, up to that point where it will emerge out of overmind and cross the border into supramental gnosis. So, parenthetically, this is where Sri Aurobindo stops the speculation. He doesn't proceed beyond, because he's only going to write from his actual experience. This nature of the gnosis would evidently determine all the relations of the life or group life of Gnostic beings. For a Gnostic collectivity would be a collective soul power of the truth consciousness, even as the Gnostic individual would be an individual soul power of it. It would have the same integration of life and action in unison, the same realized and conscious unity of being, the same spontaneity, intimate oneness feeling, one and mutual truth vision and truth sense of self and each other, the same truth action in the relation of each with each and all with all. This collectivity would be an act not as a mechanical, but a spiritual integer. So here he's describing a collective Gnostic life which is fully consonant with the individual's Gnostic life, because Sri Aurobindo was not simply practicing an isolated yoga, he was living in concert with all of those who had gathered around him. The light that was in him he did not keep for himself. He shed it radiantly, abundantly on all, to see, experimentally too, how much they could respond. You remember his correspondence, he's not simply writing words, he's transmitting force. He's watching idea and force penetrate an individual, help them to evolve, to dispossess themselves of ignorance, to introduce themselves to unknown soul powers and descending lights from above, and watching the impact that each has upon the developing collective life, all of it rising. And so he's writing here as if he's theorizing, but this is observational as well. He's watching what the actual effects of this descending truth consciousness as it approaches him and the mother affects in the life of the whole. What are its real horizons for action? A similar inevitability of the union of freedom and order would be the law of the collective life. It would be a freedom of the diverse play of the infinite in divine souls, and order of the conscious unity of souls, which is the law of the supramental infinite. Remember this argument, this thought, this idea of freedom and order is part of his consideration of the ethical compass of the Gnostic individual in the Gnostic life. How will we deport ourselves? How will we act with others? Well, he describes here that just as there's an automatic alignment between the freedom that we possess and the ordering of that freedom in a full expression in life, which arrives at no contradiction or contrariety, is true for the collective also. The group life will behave in the same way, or it gets drawn up to it. Now, Sri Aurobindo was a close student of all of those around him. I'm not saying that he felt that there was a perfect collective expression in the Sri Aurobindo ashram of what these Gnostic possibilities are. But still, it is an effort, and an early pioneering effort at that. Our mental rendering of oneness brings into it the rule of sameness. A complete oneness brought about by the mental reason drives towards a thoroughgoing standardization as its one effective mean. Only minor shades of differentiation would be allowed to operate. But the greatest richness of diversity in the self-expression of oneness would be the law of the Gnostic life. In the Gnostic consciousness, difference would not lead to discord, but to a spontaneous natural adaptation, a sense of complementary plenitude, a rich, many-sided execution of the thing to be collectively known, done, worked out in life. For the difficulty in mind and life is created by ego, by separation of integers into component parts, which figure as contraries, opposites, disparates. All in which they separate from each other is easily felt, affirmed, and stressed. That in which they meet, whatever holds their divergences together, is largely missed or found with difficulty. Everything has to be done by an overcoming or an adjustment of difference by a constructed unity. There is indeed an underlying principle of oneness, and nature insists on its emergence in a construction of unity, for she is collective and communal as well as individual and egoistic, and has her instrumentation of associativeness, sympathies, common needs, interests, attractions, affinities, as well as her more brutal means of unification. He leaves them unnamed, but conquest would be among them. But her secondary imposed and too prominent basis of ego life and ego nature overlays the unity and afflicts all its constructions with imperfection and insecurity. A farther difficulty is created by the absence, or rather the imperfection, of intuition and direct inner contact, making each a separate being forced to learn with difficulty the other's being and nature. To arrive at understanding and mutuality and harmony from outside instead of inwardly, through a direct sense and grasp, so that all mental and vital interchange is hampered, rendered ego-tainted, or doomed to imperfection and incompleteness by the veil of mutual ignorance. So, the problem of intersubjectivity rendered in the collective. We don't really know, when we're housed in ignorance, what the other person feels, sees, thinks, why they're motivated to do this or that. So we think, we guess, we hypothesize, often in error. But we still arrive at some kind of accord. We do get to some level of understanding, mutuality and harmony. But that's all external. Sri Aurobindo's idea of a Gnostic life would find us arriving at harmony, mutuality, and understanding from inside as an outgrowth of the soul power which inhabits our real nature and of which we have become aware. He continues, in the collective Gnostic life, the integrating truth sense, the concording unity of Gnostic nature, would carry all divergences in itself as its own opulence, and turn a multitudinous thought, action, feeling into the unity of a luminous life whole. This would be the evident principle, the inevitable result of the very character of the truth consciousness and its dynamic realization of the spiritual unity of all being. This realization, the key to the perfection of life, difficult to arrive at on the mental plane, difficult even when realized to dynamize or organize, would be naturally dynamic, spontaneously self-organized in all Gnostic creation and Gnostic life. This much is easily understandable if we regard the Gnostic beings as living their own life without any contact with the life of the ignorance. But by the very fact of the evolution here, the Gnostic manifestation would be a circumstance, though a decisive circumstance, in the whole. There would be a continuance of the lower degrees of the consciousness and life, some maintaining the manifestation in the ignorance, some mediating between it and the manifestation in the gnosis. These two forms of being and life would either exist side by side or interpenetrate. In either case, the Gnostic principle might be expected, if not at once, yet finally to dominate the whole. So, as a hand slips into a glove, this higher consciousness enters into the actual nature as we find it here, deals with the ignorance, and slowly through its harmonic action, brings it towards and then into divinity. So, you see, the hint here is that nature suffers no abolition. It is not erased by the manifestation of a divine consciousness. It is suffused with that light. He goes on, and we'll bring Monsieur Teilhard de Chardin back into the discussion shortly in this regard. The higher spiritual mental degrees would be in touch with the supramental principle, now overtly supporting them and holding them together, and would be delivered from the once enveloping hold of the ignorance and inconscience. Remember, he's describing here the Gnostic being and the Gnostic life as expressed in the collectivity. So the higher mind, the illumined mind, intuition and overmind would all be playing in this Gnostic being and Gnostic collectivity, but the supramental would be expressive through those ranges of the superconscience. And so, ignorance would have less and less hold of us, even as we deal with our material bodies and the prana that moves through those bodies. As manifestations of the truth of being, though in a qualified and modified degree, they would draw all their light and energy from the supramental gnosis and would be in large contact with its instrumental powers. They would themselves be conscious motive powers of the Spirit, and although not yet in the full force of their entirely realized spiritual substance, they would not be subjected to a lesser instrumentation, fragmented, diluted, diminished, obscured by the substance of the nescience. All ignorance, rising or entering into the overmind, into the intuitive, into the illumined or higher mind being, would cease to be ignorance. It would enter into the light, realize in that light the truth which it had covered with its darkness, and undergo a liberation, transmutation, new state of consciousness and being which would assimilate it to these higher states and prepare it for the supramental status. So it is being lifted into light. What it has ignored in becoming ignorance, as the borders of that ignoring are shaded away, it begins to feel at once the truth of its essence and the broadening of the context, and realizes its oneness with all around, and the power, the density of ignorance is lessened. At the same time, the involved principle of the gnosis, acting now as an overt, arisen, and constantly dynamic force, and no longer only as a concealed power with a secret origination or a veiled support of things, or an occasional intervention as its only function, would be able to lay something of its law of harmony on the still existing inconscience and ignorance. So there is the descent of the light from above, from the supramental through the various ranges of superconscience, reaching down into the actual instrumentation of our being, but there is also the rising up, as if it's being called up by the descending light, of the involved supramental power, which exists at the core of the inconscience and rises up to meet. And as it rises, still more do we feel the effulgence of light, shedding the dimensions of ignorance. For the secret Gnostic power, concealed in them, would act with a greater strength of its support and origination, a freer and more powerful intervention. The beings of the ignorance, influenced by the light of the gnosis, through their association with Gnostic beings and through the evolved and effective presence of the supramental being and power in earth nature, would be more conscious and responsive. In the untransformed part of humanity itself, there might well arise a new and greater order of mental human beings, for the directly intuitive or partly intuitivized but not yet Gnostic mental being, the directly or partly illumined mental being, the mental being in direct or part communion with the higher thought plane would emerge. These would become more and more numerous, more and more evolved and secure in their type, and might even exist as a formed race of higher humanity, leading upwards the less evolved in a true fraternity born of the sense of the manifestation of the one divine in all beings. Now this idea, which would later be articulated as a potential intermediate race standing between current humanity and the supramental being, We'll get stronger articulation later, but here Sri Aurobindo sets it out. The impact of the Gnostic life upon the earth would tend to draw all of ignorance upwards, and those parts of humanity which are open, which find this greater light accessible to them, would feel the import and the impact and would be lifted. In this way, he says, the consummation of the highest might mean also a lesser consummation in its own degree of what must remain still below. Because we're not going to abrogate all the chain of evolution back to its basis. We're going to lift things and maintain the evolutionary change. We're going to evolve beyond the mind, but the chain must not be broken. At the higher end of the evolution, the ascending ranges and summits of supermind would begin to rise towards some supreme manifestation of the pure spiritual existence, consciousness, and delight of being of Satchit Ananda. So the supramental presence established on earth affects all the way down to matter, begins to call the hidden supramental involved, all the way down really at the core of the inconscious, to come up and meet it. It's calling itself to come out and play in what was dark, now let's make it light. But also, there's the other range. We can rise beyond the supramental, back into those fields of ananda, of bliss, of chit tapas, conscious power and force, of sheer, beautiful existence, sat. A question might arise whether the Gnostic reversal, the passage into a Gnostic evolution and beyond it, would not mean sooner or later the cessation of the evolution from the inconscience, since the reason for that obscure beginning of things here would cease. Well, this is a cosmic question, considered by other thinkers. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, of course, had the idea of an omega point at the end of evolution and perhaps the disappearance of the universe back into the divine at that stage. But for Sri Aurobindo, the universe will not disappear into light. He explains, this depends on the farther question whether the movement between the superconscience and the inconscience as the two poles of existence is an abiding law of the material manifestation or only a provisional circumstance. The latter supposition, the provisional, the latter supposition is difficult to accept because of the tremendous force of pervasiveness and durability with which the inconscient foundation has been laid for the whole material universe. Think of the width, the breadth of the cosmos. We supramentalize this point of the cosmos. Does it mean that now suddenly the whole cosmos has been divinized? Any complete reversal or elimination of the first evolutionary principle would mean the simultaneous manifestation of the secret involved consciousness in every part of this vast universal inconscience. A change in a particular line of nature, such as the earth line, could not have any such all-pervading effect. The manifestation in earth nature has its own curve, and the completion of that curve is all that we have to consider. So the supermind made material on earth, does not eradicate ignorance throughout the material cosmos. Here, this much might be hazarded, that in the final result of the revelatory creation or reproduction of the upper hemisphere of conscious being in the lower triplicity, the evolution here, though remaining the same in its degrees and stages, would be subjected to the law of harmony, the law of unity in diversity, and of diversity working out unity. It would be no longer an evolution through strife. It would become a harmonious development from stage to stage, from lesser to greater light, from type to higher type of the power and beauty of a self-unfolding existence. It would only be otherwise if for some reason the law of struggle and suffering still remained necessary for the working out of that mysterious possibility in the infinite, whose principle underlies the plunge into the inconscious. But for the earth nature, it would seem as if this necessity might be exhausted once the supramental gnosis had emerged from the inconscience. A change would begin with its firm appearance. That change would be consummated when the supramental evolution became complete and rose into the greater fullness of a supreme manifestation of the existence consciousness delight, Satchit Ananda. So this possibility, why the infinite plunged into the inconscience, is placed it almost into poetic terms in the description of why that might have been many, many chapters ago in the Life Divine. But he does not insist that that insight has to be the basis of our supposition in this context. Still, here we are, regarding the supramental as it expresses the perfect unity, the complete infinity of existence, consciousness, delight, Satchit Ananda. This is the great concept of the Life Divine. Satchit Ananda expresses itself as the supramental conscious power, but remains above, leaning into the unknowable, that indefinable, which is beyond even that. So next week, we take up the last chapter in the Life Divine, chapter 28, the Divine Life. Thank you for your continued goodwill and your continued companionship as we've traveled on this long journey. We think that we may finish our reading of the Life Divine on the weekend following the 15th. Let us see. Namaste. Let us see. But that would be as when we began our study of the Life Divine on the Sunday following the 15th of August. There would be a broad symmetry in that. Let us see if we can do it. Tonight, we read from Savitri. This is Book 7. The Book of Yoga, Canto 7, the Cosmic Spirit and Cosmic Consciousness. A voice began to speak from her own heart that was not hers, yet mastered thought and sense. As it spoke, all changed within her and without. All was, all lived. She felt all being one. The world of unreality ceased to be. There was no more a universe built by mind, convicted as a structure or a sign. A spirit, a being, saw created things and cast itself into unnumbered forms, and was what it saw and made. All now became an evidence of one stupendous truth, a truth in which negation had no place, a being and a living consciousness, a stark and absolute reality. There the unreal could not find a place. The sense of unreality was slain. There all was conscious, made of the infinite. All had a substance of eternity. Yet this was the same indecipherable. It seemed to cast from it universe like a dream, vanishing forever into an original void. But this was no more some vague ubiquitous point, or a cipher of vastness, an unreal naught. It was the same, but now no more seemed far to the living clasp of her recovered soul. It was herself. It was the self of all. It was the reality of existing things. It was the consciousness of all that lived and felt and saw. It was timelessness and time. It was the bliss of formlessness and form. It was all love and the one beloved's arms. It was sight and thought in one all-seeing mind. It was joy of being on the peaks of God. She passed beyond time into eternity, slipped out of space, and became the infinite. Her being rose into unreachable heights and found no end of its journey in the self. It plunged into the unfathomable deeps and found no end to the silent mystery that held all world within one lonely breast, yet harbored all creation's multitudes. She was all vastness and one measureless point. She was a height beyond heights, a depth beyond depths. She lived in the everlasting and was all that harbors death and bears the wheeling hours. All contraries were true in one huge spirit, surpassing measure, change, and circumstance. An individual, one with cosmic self, in the heart of the transcendence miracle, and the secret of world personality, was the Creator and the Lord of all. Mind was a single innumerable look upon himself and all that he became. Life was his drama, and the vast a stage. The universe was his body, God its soul. All was one single immense reality, all its innumerable phenomenon.